Hi everyone, welcome to the third Degrowth talk, No Back to Normal. I'm Oksana and I'll be facilitating this session. Behind the screens there's also Lorenzo who will be helping with the technical side of things and collecting the questions from the chat. If you haven't seen the first two webinars, this series is organized by the UK Degrowth Summer School. Since due to the pandemic, the physical summer school couldn't happen this year, we decided to bring online some of the discussions that we planned for the initial program. And today we will be discussing one important topic which doesn't always receive enough attention in degrowth debates. We'll be talking about the transformation of the monetary system. And we are very lucky to have with us today an exceptional panel of 4 speakers: Mary Mellor, Louison Cahen-Fourot, Ament, and Julio Linares. We will start with opening talks in which the speakers will address the problems associated with the current monetary system and share their vision of a more sustainable and just one, and also reflect on how we can transition to such a better system. Then we'll continue with the discussion, and if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. And we expect the webinar to last for about 1 hour, 40 minutes. And the last thing, make sure to check the video description for some readings on the topic. And okay, without any further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, Mary Mellor. She's Emeritus Professor at Northumbria University, UK, where she was founding chair of the university's Sustainable Cities Research Institute. She has published extensively on gender and the environment, social, green, and feminist economics, and the democratization of money as a public resource. Her books include Feminism and Ecology, The Future of Money from Financial Crisis to Public Resource, and Debt or Democracy, Public Money for Sustainability and Social Justice. Mary, I hand it over to you.
Yes, and my most recent book comes out as Money, Myths, Truths, and Alternatives. And that is what I'm very concerned with, the power of the myth of money. And all my books on money have been aimed at undermining this power, because it's not just the power that the market has over money, it's the power of the ideology of money that fuels the dominance of the market system, particularly driven by neoliberalism. So my concern has been very much with public money. But you could as equally make a case for social money, which I would have no objection to. But my concern is public money, is the way we can democratize money and make it available for people to have, in fact, economic democracy. And the myths about money are that there's a shortage of money. We're always told, where's the money to come from? Where's the magic money trees? And and the idea that money is in short supply and therefore it should go to the people who could best use it. And the ideology says that the public sector wastes money and the most efficient is the private sector. And there's a zero sum. Because there's a shortage of money, then it's a competition between the public and the market. And so that if you want a society based on social justice, ecological sustainability at a public level, as opposed to more self-contained social organizations. But if you want to do it at a public level, you've got to undermine the power and the ideology of money. Money is, we'd all agree, I think, but probably listening to this output, that money, the current money system is destructive of people and planet. We know it's speculative, it's exploitative, and it's ecologically damaging. And that money is seen as the criteria for everything. It's the medium on which the system operates, but also it's the measure of success. Money is more important, the money outcome is more important than other outcomes. And the reason that the money is associated with the drive for growth is that the two things which, again, we're very familiar with, the search for profit, that is, money has to generate more money. Obviously, there's an inbuilt growth impetus there. But also, very importantly, the prevalence of debt. And debt has to be, drives growth because debt has to be repaid with interest. And that, again, is a growth. if these are only money terms, the growth in profit and the growth in debt is only in money terms, that's still destructive. But if it tips over into increased exploitation of resources, then that becomes ecologically damaging as well. Because of the ideology that all the wealth in society is produced by the market, public spending is seen as being dependent on taxing the private, or it's presented as taxing the private sector. If you hear people talk about it, they say, oh, we've got to build up the economy to be able to afford our public services. If you run out of the ability to tax, if public spending still outstrips the ability to tax, then the instruction on the public sector is to borrow from the private sector. So the assumption being that nearly everybody you hear speaking on the telly or anywhere always seem to imply that the market is making the money, and this is what the public sector lives on, as it were. Now, borrowing has had catastrophic impact. The 2007 to 8 crisis led to a lot of public borrowing. And we know the penalty for that was austerity, particularly in the UK. Not so much in other countries, but in the UK. So we lived under a dreadful, cruel cut on welfare states. If you've got a spare bedroom, if you have more than a certain number of people in a house, and you had one extra bedroom, you had to pay a special bedroom tax. People who were sick were sanctioned because they couldn't get to interviews to get jobs, to apply for jobs in job centres. Just nasty, cruel things that was going on. And this was all because they're deemed to be borrowing from the market. Except, of course, when they want, the market needs help, the market needs support, and suddenly the state's perfectly acceptable, and money from the state's perfectly acceptable. So the ideology puts the people as the public at a disadvantage. What has happened is that because we've given all the notion that the creation of money comes from the market, then if the market fails or the debt system fails through the banking system, which either can fail, then the state has to step in. And that is the point at which we can open up the critique of money, because if the public sector can create the money to save the banking system or to save the economy in the present crisis of pandemic, then obviously there is an independent power of the state to create money. And that is what I've been trying to show, that this does exist, that the ideology of money being generated by the market is not correct. So the alternative view I take is that money is not just a public responsibility when the market fails. It is, or it should be seen as, a public resource. And it's important to challenge that thing about the shortage of money, because there is no basis for the shortage of money. I mean, today, money is just numbers. The image you have from the ideology, the neoliberal ideology, is somehow it's sort of pseudo gold, and therefore it's in short supply. But in fact, money is dematerialized in the sense where it's, like I said, it's just numbers now. Numbers in our accounts saying what we're entitled to have, our wages, our incomes, our pensions, our welfare, and the obligations we have to pay for things, for meeting debts, paying taxes. And it's largely an accounting mechanism. So I see there as being two sources of money, and I've described it in my books as the two circuits of money. One is the one which people are familiar with, that the banks lend money, and well, actually people don't necessarily. I've got that quite wrong. There was no real explanation in the neoliberal or conventional economic explanation of where money did come from, because it didn't come from the state. The state's not allowed to print money. It didn't come from the market because the market doesn't create money, and it's only been accepted being accepted in this century that the banks are actually creating money out of fresh air, and that becomes a democratic question. If banks are creating money out of fresh air, then on whose authority are they doing it? And when they've created a lot of money out of fresh air, and it's become problematic, then the state has to step in with its ability to create money to rescue the situation. So the two circuits of money I see as creating money are banks when they lend. They expand the money supply when they lend, and they contract the money supply when the debts are paid back. But as I said before, they're paid back with interest. So there is a growth dynamic in there. Now, state spend is a little more, I think, is less accepted, but I think is the case. That the state is also creating money out of fresh air, like the banks, but because it's the state who spends the money, it's not issued as debt. The act of spending public money is the act of money creation, because when the public sector sets up a budget, it is establishing that those numbers exist and they're allocated to the health service and the education system and all the rest of it. That money has been created, is circulated, and then it is later retrieved by a variety of methods. And I think one is obviously taxation to retrieve money. And the reason you retrieve the money is because if you created and spent all your to pay off your whole public sector and didn't tax, then you'd have massive inflation in the market system. Because I assume the market system will still exist in a more limited form. So the two circuits operate: the lending by the banks and the circuit coming back to repayment. But the arrow coming back, the repayment, must always be more than the spend than the lending, because otherwise there's no profit in lending. I think the reason for the confusion of why money spending and lending is that the central bank is the apex of the banking system, which is the lending source of money, but it is also part of the state, which is the spending source of money. And when the state, when the government interacts with the central bank, it's not sure if it's interacting with it as a money creator without debt, or as a money creator with debt, and it can go either way. So what's the way through this? What's the way out of this? I think money creation should be transparent and accountable. And therefore, if banks are creating money out of nothing, they should be utility banks. They should be part of the public sector. If they want to be private and do away with all public support, that's another matter. But I think the idea of privately run public issue banks that have a public underpinning is democratically wrong. So what kind of money system would I have? I wouldn't have money issued as debt. I would only have money issued as only money created as debt. I'd have money created without debt. If the money later is passed on as a debt, that's another matter. But the point of money creation, where money first exists, to me, should be a public matter. And we should aim, obviously, for socially just and ecologically sustainable societies, sustainable money systems. I talk about wealth, W-E-L-L-T-H, as benefit, and not wealth, W-E-A-L-T-H, as profit accumulation. And I very much wanted to have the idea that money is a social construct. There's nothing real about money. And therefore, it should be, part of the democratic process to decide how much money we have, what we do with it, whether we demand it back in taxation, how much in taxation, who should pay the taxes, on what basis. We should not be borrowing off the private sector. If we borrow off anybody, it should be the central bank, but there should be no selling of public debt to the public sector, because we've just been heard that our Chancellor of the Exchequer is going to raise £299 billion from the money markets to save the economy with the shutdown, the lockdown. Well, if the private sector has £299 billion to spare, why doesn't it rescue the private sector itself? Why lend it to the state and trap the future members of the state in a cycle of debt repayment? The private sector needs public debt more than the public sector needs private debt, because the private sector, the only safe port of call in the end is the public sector. It's public money. The most powerful is public money. And the market is not the creator of wealth and money. It is a sump. It's a pit into which public money goes. The private sector needs the public sector more than the public sector needs the private sector, and that is the basis of my of what I've been trying to write and indicate.
Great, thank you very much, Mary. Our second speaker is Louison Cahen-Fourot. He's a postdoc researcher and assistant professor at the Institute for Ecological Economics at the VU, Vienna University of Economics and Business. His research is in ecological macroeconomics and the political economy of capitalism and the environment. Louison, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you very much for the invitation, and hi everyone. It's my first YouTube live stream, so I hope I will be clear enough. So in the preparation of this talk, we were asked 3 questions. The first one was, what are the major problems with the current monetary system? The second one was, what a just and sustainable monetary system could look like? And the third one is, what policies and strategies a transition to a better monetary system would require? Yes, in 12 minutes, that sounds completely reasonable, right? So I think I will focus on the first 2 and keep the third one for the discussion. I agree with a lot of things that Mary Mellor has said, but I disagree with one thing, which is cool, because if we were all to agree on everything, it would not be fun, right? And I wanted to start my talk with this. Before I want to tackle one of the major problems with the current monetary system, I want to start by deconstructing still widespread belief and to mention briefly what is not a problem in the current monetary system. The common belief, I think Mary Mellor has talked about it, is that money created as debt bearing interest would create a continuous shortage of money. So we need to create always more money, and that can only be possible if we grow production to sustain the additional stock of debt. So it's an accounting argument. The problem is, like, this accounting argument is wrong, actually. It stems from a confusion between stock and flows, and the literature now in ecological economics, in ecological macroeconomics, has largely deconstructed it. This is not to say that debt and interest rate are not involved in other kind of growth imperative, but this pure accounting argument has actually been proven to be wrong. And I think degrowth would benefit from moving forward and to consider this literature and to stop considering this belief. Why is it wrong? Because, as you know, the supply of money is endogenously determined by the agent when they express a demand for money. So actually causality goes from growth to money and not from money to growth. And there is a reflux mechanism, of course. Like, when people spend money, this money can be used to repay debt. So for instance, if we imagine a stationary state economy, that is an economy that would not grow anymore, the current stock of money would be sufficient given the current volume of goods and services in circulation, you know. But still, in a stationary state economy, it has been shown in accounting consistent framework that you can perfectly have positive interest rate. Does not triggers growth. What is problematic is when a sector of the economy, for instance, the rich households or the firms or the banks, hoard money, accumulate money at a rate that is that is higher than the growth rate of the economy. That is problematic, and that creates a growth imperative. But that could happen perfectly without interest rates, without debt. It's an accounting. If you don't grow, if a sectors accumulate, then another sectors need to go further into debt and into poverty. So it's not sustainable in the long run. But that has nothing to do with interest rate or debt per se. So I think we really need to make clear that this belief has been proven wrong. And my only concern here is that the proponents of this monetary growth imperative so far have failed to make their point in an accounting consistent framework, you know. So I think we would all benefit from considering the scientific literature on the topic that has deconstructed this argument. All right. So what I want to say by this is that I think what is at stake is not the monetary creation itself. And I think on this we will agree. It is rather the institutional context into which this monetary creation process happens. So the question really is political rather than technical. And I think on this we agree. It is, for instance, who should control the banks? What is money creation used for, or what should it be used for? You know, and I will come back to this when sketching what could be a sustainable monetary system. But now I want to insist briefly on, I think, a key characteristic of the current monetary system that creates high unsustainability, but which is very often overlooked. And this problem is liquidity. Now we have a monetary and financial system which is very much geared toward liquidity. What is liquidity? It is the extent to which an asset, for instance, a financial asset like a share, or a fixed asset like a machine, like a plant, can be sold to retrieve cash. So essentially, liquidity refers to the interchangeability between an asset and money. So essentially, being geared towards liquidity means privileging money in the liquid form and short term to investment and long terms, all right? And this has very concrete consequence. For instance, when it comes to banks, during the emergence of financial capitalism, or finance-led capitalism, the beginning of the 80s, banks have shifted from a model of banking called originate and hold, that is, they would originate credits and hold it in their balance sheet, establishing long-term relationship with the borrowers. They've shifted from originate and hold to a model of banking known as originate and distribute. That is, you will originate credits, but you don't care about the credit being repaid, because what you do is like you bundle the credit together, you securitize them, you transform them into financial assets, then you sell on the market and you retrieve cash instantaneously. So banks have started to do this as a lot, and this drives high unsustainability in the monetary system, because either banks will lend to anyone regardless of their solvability, and the subprime crisis was a prime example, to say, of this. You've all heard about the ninja loans, you know, no income, no jobs, no assets. People corresponding to those ninja were granted loans while they had no way whatsoever to pay back their debt. Or the banks will lend only to agents that can offer sufficient profitability according to their own standard, to the profit norm of the banks, you know. And this is a major impediment as well, because it prevents a lot of insufficiently profitable activities, according to the banks, to be funded, activities that could be socially or environmentally useful. And now we have a major problem in the economy, because, as you know, the profit norm, the profit standard is way, way higher than the economic reality. When you have a return on equity or return on investment standard of 15%, while the growth rate of the economy is currently like between 0 and even, for instance, minus 8%, this is completely insane. This is completely unrealistic. We have the same phenomenon with firms, you know. The firms during finance-led capitalism shifted from the model of retain and reinvest. You will retain the profit within the firm and you will reinvest in productive capital or in innovation, to a model of downsize and distribute. That is, you will compress the wage, you will shrink the number of workers, and you will distribute the money as dividends through artificially or through increasing the pure financial profitability of the firm. And this, of course, triggers massive unemployment. This is one of the major sources of mass unemployment. So it's high social unsustainability, and it also decreases productive investment and innovation capability. So it's also a major impediment for the ability of the productive structure of firms to transition to more sustainable production processes. It also leads to offshoring of production in, for instance, less socially or environmentally friendly countries. So the consequence of this liquidity-based monetary and financial systems, in a sense, to sum up, it brings economic and financial turmoil, and the monetary policies that are used to kind of repair this turmoil, for instance, unconventional monetary policies like quantitative easings and so on. The problem is they are not environmental neutral. They are environmentally harmful. For instance, a study in 2017 have shown that 62% of the European Central Bank and 49% of the Bank of England asset purchase concerns carbon-intensive sectors. So the effect of the monetary policies implemented to try to prevent this unsustainable monetary system from collapsing, the effect of those monetary policies actually created better financing conditions for climate destroying and environment destroying activities. So the consequence of this liquidity oriented monetary system is like a lot of very high social and environmental unsustainability. So now, since I still have 2 minutes, right, or a little bit more perhaps, I'll try to say a few words of what a just and sustainable monetary system could look like. And on this question, I think we have a lot of convergences with Mary and probably also with the other speakers. First of all, I think something was very clear in Mary's talk, that money is not an ordinary asset or good, it is a social relation. And I think this is absolutely, this is like the key point when thinking about what could be a sustainable monetary system, to start from this. Money is a social relation, it is a socio-political institution. And so this, of course, should be reflected in the monetary system, you know. Why is it a social relation? Because it is a link, money is a link between decentralized producers and consumers on a given space. It allows to settle debt, right? This was the primary reason for the appearance of money in history, to settle debts. Money was never a mean for exchange in the first moment of its existence. And so we should like invent a monetary system that reflect the social dimension of money. So central bank, of course, in this setting should not be independent. The notion of independence for central bank makes no sense whatsoever if you consider that money is a social relation, right? Also because central banks are not independent from the financial system, and that is a major problem for our societies. So we should come back to an era of what we call financial repression, that is an extremely tight financial regulation. The banks, they should be put under direct democratic control, under the control of citizens, that is, they should be turned, not only be nationalized, of course that would be already a good step, but they should be turned into a common. But to be turned into a common, the monetary system need to be reduced in size, all right, to avoid being too complex. And usually in the monetary system or financial system, what is too complex is necessarily useless for the real economy and for social or environmental useful activities. So banks could be nationalized and turned into a common. Retail and investment banking should be separated. Banks could be reduced in size to prevent systemic too big to fail banks to exist. For instance, we should really forbid useless and harmful structured finance activities. We could tax balance sheets according to their composition and to their size. The banks could be also territory and sector focused to promote local development, to promote innovation or the emergence of key sectors that would be deemed useful by the society, and also to accompany harmful sector until all jobs are terminated in those sector in a manner that is smooth enough for the people of those who work on those sector to be able to requalify themselves, to retrain themselves, and so on. So it does not create massive unemployment, additional massive unemployment. And then there is another series of measures that we can discuss later. And a final point that I want to make, because I think that's the end of my time, is that I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. That's the good news. When it comes to monetary system, the monetary history is full of tools, is full of experience that we can use. And the single fact that nowadays some measures are presented as super exotic, while they were like completely mainstream in central banking a few decades ago, shows how much with political decision have deprived us from really useful tools. Now, the good news is what has been politically unmade can be politically remade. So it's up to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Louison. Our third speaker is Joe Ament. He completed his PhD at the University of Vermont, US, where he studied with Josh Farley and researched monetary theory and policy in the context of social and ecological equity. His work currently looks at public banking at the national and local levels, as well as central banking policy for combating climate change and income inequality. Joe, please.
Joe, you're muted.
Great. Sorry about that. Yeah, I knew going third was going to be difficult, but following Mary and Louison is this is tough. I sort of just want to. Let me start by just sort of saying, answering the first question that we were sort of prompted with, which is what are the major problems with the current monetary system? And I think this is not going to come as a surprise to anyone, but it's this idea that our monetary system is led by private institutions. As Mary and Louison have both discussed, the vast majority of our money supply is created by the commercial banking industry when they extend loans to households and corporations. And within that, we get this sort of philosophical contradiction that both of the speakers before me mentioned, this idea that money is a social relationship, right? When we use it individually, its value is upheld by the social networks we have. And when we use it socially, obviously, it's a social relation when we spend on public work projects and things like that. But when the money is created privately, it creates this contradiction that in that its acceptance, its circulation, its stability is all social, yet its creation and the benefit of its first use is private, right? So we get this philosophical contradiction sort of from day one. And I think that's sort of the largest problem with the current monetary system. And that sort of encapsulates the manner in which money is created. But even now, when we start looking at monetary and fiscal policy, we see that the private financial institutions of the world are absolutely critical to monetary and fiscal policies. And to a certain degree, Mary and Louison have both hinted at that. But monetary policy largely exists to support the banking and financial industry, and fiscal policy is largely undertaken as a function of selling debt to that financial industry, right? And then Mary hinted at this, and I think she said the public sector needs public debt. So fiscal policy is absolutely critical to upholding that financial industry, right? So what we're seeing is that the public and social nature of money has sort of been overtaken by this privatization and the private nature of the money system we have. I think that's the biggest issue facing us. Now, stepping back for a moment, I think, and I knew that this topic was going to come up, especially following Louison. I knew that this issue was going to come up today, but what drives the growth imperative? We need to ask that, right? It needs to be answered well if we're going to talk about transitioning our monetary system in a degrowth world. Because the answer to what drives the growth imperative is going to inform the approach that we take, right? So this idea, hold on, if you'll bear with me one moment, there's a F-35 flying outside of my house. I apologize for that. We've got some loud planes. So this idea of a monetary growth imperative, Mary sort of said that this interest rate creates a monetary growth imperative, and that's been discussed in the degrowth literature quite a bit. Louison, and I mean, he's written a fabulous paper with Mark Lavoie and done other work that says, no, that's not the case, that interest does not create a growth imperative. Honestly, regardless, we can get into some of those discussions, but regardless of your specific point of view on whether or not interest creates a growth imperative, I think that we can understand that this growth imperative largely comes from the fact that the financial sector creates the money supply, right? We've talked, and sure, from an accounting consistent framework, we can create models in which the interest rate doesn't technically create the growth imperative, but more largely, this debt service, the quest for profitability, the propensity to save and accumulate wealth, these things are interconnected historically with the rise of capitalism and interconnected with the growth imperatives we see today, right? So we do see that this private monetary system is deeply interconnected with this growth imperative. And that's from the monetary perspective. From the political perspective, we see that there's this political motivation that politicians must create policies that strive toward growth in order to stop debt, unemployment, poverty from becoming economically destabilizing, right? So we sort of see this privatization of our money supply, creating this really unstable system in which we need to completely continue to grow. And if that's from an interest rate or something else within that system, you know, that can be debated. So then I think, I mean, that's just a simple answer, that I think our private-led money system is the biggest issue we're facing in the degrowth community and that our world faces. So then the question obviously is then, what does a just and sustainable monetary system look like? And every time I see this question, I struggle with it, and I sit back, and I think this is the problem that everyone who's talking today and everyone probably who's watching today has to face, is that we can probably envision a just money system that is extractive, right? We can envision a sustainable money system that is incredibly unjust. So having a just and sustainable monetary system is where it gets really difficult. And Louison, what you said about the actual regulations and financial repression, I agree with every single thing you said. I like to think about these things sort of short-term, medium, and long-term. I think sort of the rest of what I'm going to say sort of is going to be in the context of the crisis that we're facing right now. I think this pandemic has shown us a lot about the precarity of our financial system. And I think it's shown us a little bit about the tools that the state has at its disposal to address some issues. So I think right now in the short term, it's about using some of what we're seeing as a trial and error to see what works in terms of addressing some of the problems we have. Short term, it can look like monetary financing. We're seeing much expanded quantitative easing. In the UK, we've seen the central bank open up a ways and means facility, which is essentially an overdraft facility for the Treasury. So in the short term, we're seeing a lot of ways that there's more coordination between the central bank and the Treasury in order to address the crisis at our hands. Then if we think of climate change and income inequality and inequitable access to health and education, if we think of all of those as crises, sort of I think what Mary was hinting at earlier, we've got some tools at our disposal coming out of this crisis to face the other crises that we will be facing in the next century. In the medium term, I think it looks similar, like that monetary and fiscal coordination on specific goals and missions that we have for society. I think the idea of patient finance, where we have long-term committed systems of finance instead of short-term, quick return on investment type facilities, state equity holdings within corporations instead of just debt and credit-led stability in the financial system. You know, actually having state take equity holdings in these sort of corporations, both from a solvency health perspective, but also for the state to be able to use, again, those goals and missions and guide sort of the industrial productive economies that we have. And then forms of cooperative ownership in society more generally. And I know that some of those things might sound more like capitalist ownership structures, but as I sort of, and less about the monetary system per se, but as I sort of hinted at earlier, I think that it's really hard to disentangle private capitalist ownership structures from bank created and privately held financial systems. I think those two historically and importantly now are incredibly intertwined. So I think those ownership structures are closely related to our financial system more broadly. And then long term, I agree with both Mary and Louison that long term it looks more like nationalized banking systems where commercial banks become more like intermediaries, like they do according to a lot of the neoclassical models that distribute funds from savers to borrowers, right? They act as this financial intermediary, and the state takes more of a heavy hand in creating the money that circulates in our society. But the interesting thing, going back again to goals and missions, is nationalizing the banking industry doesn't stop a growth imperative, right? So we can have a nationalized banking industry that is super growth intensive, right? So it's really about the goals that we have, because, and this goes back to what Mary said, we've always had two magic money trees. I'm going to be a bit gloomy for a moment. I think I have a minute or two. We've always had two magic money trees, right? We've been told that there isn't a magic money tree, but there's always been two. There's always been the commercial banking industry creating money out of thin air. And we've always had the state as a magic money tree existing to support that first magic money tree. Now but both of those trees were existing to serve the private sector. Now with more broad quantitative easing that has been taken in response to this crisis, and especially opening the Ways and Means facility, what we're seeing is that one of those magic money trees, the ability of the central bank to create money out of thin air, is being used to serve the public sector. Now, this is great. This is really exciting. We've got sort of this coordinated quantitative easing and direct monetary financing of the Treasury. But I don't want, let's make sure we're not too excited. I think the reason we haven't had this, or the reason we've had this debate on whether or not there is or isn't a magic money tree has been this ideological debate on the role of the state that was sort of won over for the last 50 years by the neoliberal, as Mary would call it, handbag economics, that the state is waiting for its allowance from the markets. So let's not be too excited right now when we see quantitative easing and Ways and Means facilities being opened up, because now that technical tool exists for the public, those growth pundits will still want that growth to be had in the private sector. So we're seeing the technical tool that always existed is now existing to fund the public, but that public is still going to want endless growth, right? So I think we have this really great opportunity right now to say, look, this magic money tree exists. The central bank is able to fund the Treasury through monetary financing, but it has to be for justice and sustainability. And if it's not, if we're not very specific on what those goals are and what that new magic money tree can do, we're just going to see that public money being stuffed into assets, into inequality, and into environmental destruction if it's just taken over by those growth pundits. And I think that's about my time. So I'm very happy to hear from Julio, and then also to engage in some great conversations.
Great, thank you very much, Joe. And our fourth speaker is Julio Linares. He's an economic anthropologist and works on social outreach for the Basic Income Earth Network. He holds a master's degree from the anthropology department at the London School of Economics. Before London, he lived and studied in Taiwan for 6 years, and he is now based in Berlin, where he's organizing a basic income currency project called Circles, exploring practical ways of democratizing the economy from below. Julio, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Oksana, and thank you to all the speakers so far. It's been a great discussion so far, and Maybe we'd like to start by taking some of the points that have been said so far, specifically talking about this idea of the money commons. I think this is very at the core of what needs to change if we actually want to transform the money system and sort of our economic system as a whole. From sort of, let's just as a way of pun, let's invoke the spirit of Marx. When he starts Capital, he goes about saying how, in the capitalist mode of production, the sort of way in which wealth is accumulated is through the accumulation of commodities. The form being the commodity as the way to organize everything else. And so the commodity as a unit, as an object, as a fetish, has this private property to it. We've talked about it now before. It's produced as a private commodity by banks, whether it's central bank or whether it's a private bank. Even if it's public or state property, it's still more or less working in the sense of as a private commodity. So the argument sort of in order to actually change how money is produced is to actually make it as a common. So from the get-go, how do we go about producing money that is owned as a commons? So it's communal ownership, and it's also distributed as a commons. So usually when people talk about universal basic income, they refer to it as a government policy. Like we have to ask politicians to give us a basic income. And I think this is great. This is a really valid thing to do because we need massive redistribution of wealth in the world. But the way that I've sort of gone into exploring the topic and researching on it very practically is to say, how do we go about actually democratizing money, as Mary was saying, from a very practical point of view, from its very production. And so what I'm sort of arguing at the moment is to say, can we create a basic income system that democratizes the production of money, that decentralizes its production to all people in society as an equal share of the money mass, as a base layer to then create other institutions on top, other money systems for different functions. And so that's sort of my argument for saying, how can we go about creating a different type of more equitable, just money system, a basic income that is a commons, like it's that money that is produced for it is a commons, that is democratized, meaning that at the very local levels, people have control over its issuance and its distribution. Now this, in the sort of local currency, complementary currency world, the models that are used to talk about these things are on the lines of mutual credit, such as systems in Sardex in Sardinia or Open Credit Network in the UK. But these efforts so far have been really great in showing that it's possible to create sort of relationships, social relationships that are based on local relationships of production, distribution, and so on. But at a political level, there is still a lack in saying, how can this help us into creating a different sort of paradigm, both economically and politically, in terms of how we organize the economy, to go beyond the sort of false dichotomy of the private and the public sphere. The Fed being a primordial example of this sort of conglomeration of private banks that, where the head is appointed by the president and all these things. I mean, in some ways, central banks are quite archaic institutions of late enlightenment. And I mean, I think what we argue for is sort of to say, how can we create these institutions that are really democratic at the local level through some sort of confederation of local currencies that embed and localize the different supply chains from which things come from. Because we cannot sort of separate the money system from globalized supply chain capitalism. If we are to change the sort of relationships that cause all this ecological disaster, we have to re-embed these relationships again locally in Europe. Here, I mean, I'm from Guatemala, but I'm working here in Europe, in Berlin, to try to do that in Germany, to figure out ways in which this is actually a viable economic and political alternative. Now, sort of the second thing I wanted to name is this concept that I like to think of, which is degrowth money, or traditionally this is known as demirage, which is this idea from Silvio Gesell that basically says that we have to make money less attractive as a commodity in order for it to be a means of exchange. So this type of money system that I'm arguing for would decay over time as a sort of as part of its design, as a way of avoiding the accumulation that today's money in which today's money work, right? Like when money is created out of thin air, the principal is the only thing that is produced, and people have to compete for the credit, right? For the interest. And so in moments where people run out of cash, such as the crisis that is before us, people start to hoard money, and there is this liquidity trap that happens. And in these moments, specifically in these financial crisis moments, things like demurrage or degrowth money, as I call it, can be a way in which people can start to circulate wealth as opposed to like hoard it. Now, this is important because this is a practical way in which you can decommodify money by making it more a social relation for the sake of circulating goods and services between a community. Now, having said that, it's important to think about money not in this monoculture way that sort of nation states today work on, but think about it in terms of monetary diversity. So traditionally in Mesopotamia, Sumeria, and even Egypt, money there was not just one money. There were different monies, and each of them have different functions. So one was for exchanging goods, one was for savings, and there was another one for a unit of account. And this is sort of part of the reason why these civilizations lasted so long, because in a way, with demurrage money systems, for example, you suddenly have this ability to think really long-term and plan really long-term, whether it's an investment or any sort of productive development of capacities and infrastructure and so on, as opposed to now with this sort of a positive interest rate money system where we always are discounting the short term. And so we're always thinking really in the next 3 months or the next year. Now, how do we go about organizing this, right? To make it really practical. The way we're trying to do it here in Berlin is through democratic assemblies with a rotating sort of coordination. The way this works is basically people come together from the different business sectors, the different parts of the supply chain, different cooperatives, different groups of people come together, and they say, okay, we're going to organize our own Wirtschaftsring, our own economic rings or economic circuits or circles to complement each other's supplies, to give access to liquidity to local businesses whenever there is underutilized resources, and connect them to unmet needs. And so through the sort of assembly process, you have the ability to get people to say, to sort of demystify or how would you say, to unfetishize money, because you come together and you know that the money that you're producing, and this is the project that I'm working on, sort of it's constantly issued, and it only works if there are resources that you are using it to exchange stuff with. So people suddenly feel ownership and empowerment over the fact that they can actually see and organize where the things that they buy come from, as opposed to just being a passive consumer in this globalized network of supplies that we have no control over. So democratizing money at the same time means relocalizing the relationships of production that we have to each other, and so on, and sort of, and in this way, systematically, I like to think of Murray Bookchin and his notion of confederalism. So he talks a lot about having 4 things at the same time, which is localism, self-sustainability, confederation, which is like the broader part of the system, and localism, confederation, and I missed the last one. Sorry.
Municipalism. No?
Municipalism. Yeah. So like, thank you. So basically, like how to re-embed the relationships of money into these terms. So thinking more locally and then regionally, interconnecting the different regions so they can complement their supplies in some meaningful way. Because it is not true that one community can produce everything that they can on their own. right? The whole notion of decentralizing money and also making it so you have different complementary currencies is so that different communities can sort of have trade between each other locally and complement themselves in some sort of confederated way. This makes sense, and it's something that you could create not only regionally but also at a global level in some sort of democratic confederation of not just money but also free nations. And yeah, that's exactly what I'm working on at the moment. It's an ongoing process. At the moment I don't have an academic institution backing me, but I'm still trying to produce knowledge by way of action. I don't know if you still have some time or it's good. Yeah, we can, if you want, I can stop here and we can go into the discussion to have more time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Julio. So now I'd like to give an opportunity to each of you to comment and reflect on what has been said by the other speakers, particularly addressing the differences in your views. Shall we do it in the same order? Mary, would you like to go first?
Oh, hold on, I'm muted. Just a second. Am I muted or not?
No, it's good now.
Oh, sorry, it came up and it was. But, yes, I think we're all singing from the same hymn sheet mostly, and we're just different aspects of the struggle. Really, we're puncturing at different points. The argument, the difference between Louison and myself was this business of does debt interest trigger growth? I think at the minimum it triggers monetary growth. Whether this goes on to trigger growth, environmental destruction, and that the hard end of degrowth. I don't think I claim that. I think the growth dynamic, including profit growth dynamic, doesn't automatically lead to destructive growth, but it could do it directly or indirectly. But it's not direct causation. I don't think I've ever said it was. But that might still be too close an analysis for you. I don't know. So what have I said? Joe said about, I added something I agree with. When you're rescuing businesses, you should take an equity stake in them. That's an idea people have been putting around quite a lot. And I think that is important because with the financial crisis, we just put money back in with no strings attached, really. And it wasn't justified because what you were doing was borrowing money off the financial sector to rescue the financial sector, which seems totally illogical to me. Because if they've got the money to rescue you, for you to rescue them, they can rescue themselves. I think it's a different argument with the lockdown, because nobody's to blame for that. Nobody could help a pandemic, whereas you did. The financial crisis was caused, and they've learned nothing. They've just gone on the same thing. And as we know, the money that went in quantitative easing has gone into, went temporarily anyway, into higher stock prices, making the rich richer. Which takes me on to another point, and that is that this borrowing off the private sector, only the more well-off can afford to buy public debt, and therefore it's why, if they're that well-off, can't they pay tax? What's the relationship between taxing the wealthy and borrowing off the wealthy? There's a huge difference, but it takes away the opportunity. It's the source of deep inequality. Now, the reason the Bank of England was formed was because the monarchy was running out of money. So I don't think you can tax indefinitely. But through the 50s, we taxed we taxed people up to 95%, and those were a more prosperous era than we have now, when you've got the billionaires and Richard Branson has been begging for a soft loan. I mean, you've got billionaires coming in for a soft loan. So really, the politics of borrowing, lending, bailing out, I think really is a huge mountain mountain of contradictions to sort out. So I think those are my main thoughts.
Thank you. Louison?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you guys for your talks. I think they were great. There are three things I'd like to say, just to sorry, to reply to what Mary just said. I mean, the core of the argument is precisely to say that debt plus interest does not create monetary growth per se. But I don't want to go further into this discussion. I mean, the papers are out, so we could also exchange further on them. We read them and we can write and so on. So I'm happy to provide references to anyone interested attending the talk now. Also, people following on YouTube if they want, because otherwise we would need to go into the technicalities, and it's not the right place for it, I guess. The second point, I think I wanted to jump in to react to something that Joe has said. Joe, you said that nationalizing bank won't solve the growth imperative. On that, I absolutely agree with you, and I think that it is a very crucial point. So perhaps we could just briefly remind everyone what we mean by growth imperative, because it's not always obvious for everyone. So the growth imperative is not growth itself. The growth imperative is the need for an economy or a society to grow in order to be economically, socially, politically stable. So you could perfectly have no growth in an economy built on a growth imperative. This is the case, for instance, in the secular stagnation period we've been experiencing now since a decade. And when you don't have growth in capitalism, that is a system built on growth imperative, then you have crisis, because it's not sustainable politically, socially, and so on. So this is just to settle a bit the stage. So I completely agree with you that nationalizing bank won't solve a growth imperative. Now, the question we want to ask is, from where does this growth imperative come from then? And I totally agree with you again. My point was not at all to say, like, to exonerate the financial system from its responsibility. It's just to say that this accounting argument is completely flawed. But apart from that, I think there are many ways through which the financial system, the monetary system, can create growth imperative. Perhaps we can discuss them a bit later in the discussion. So, but I think something that we need to consider, although it's not like the core of the talk today, so I won't develop too much now. It's like the core that I think, for me, like core sources of the growth imperative don't come from the monetary side, if we think a bit in a dichotomic term, but comes from the real side, and namely from the two definitional social relation of capitalism that are very often forgotten in the discussion. That is the wage relation in one hand and the market relation in the other hand. And capitalism invented neither the wage relation nor the market relation, but what makes the historical specificity of capitalism is the generalization of those two relations, their dominance and their combination. So the fact that they became the systematic organizational principle of the economy and of social life. Why does it create a growth imperative? Because when you create a monetary separation between the producer, that is a worker, and the mean of production, you also create a structural income distribution conflict. And the only way this income distribution conflict can be normalized in the long run is for everyone, the worker, the capital owner, to have their income growing, and that requires growth. The other side is the market relation. When you implement competition relation between the producers, then you create a growth imperative, because in order for a producer to survive on the market, you need to grow. You need to be bigger than your competitors. It's no hazard that as soon as you have a cool startup inventing a new social network with a lot of photos and videos, after a couple of years, either Facebook or Microsoft will buy it, because they want to safeguard their position on the market. They want to stay bigger. So I think if we want to solve the growth imperative, we need to seriously discuss those two social relations, which are the definitional social relation of capitalism. I won't go further on that now. And third point, and Julio, I was really, really happy actually that you used those words, embedding and re-embedding. It happens that I am in Vienna, although you cannot see it from this room, but I am. And Vienna, as you know, is the city of Karl Polanyi. And Karl Polanyi created this concept of fictitious commodity. That is, things that are not commodities, but that are treated as if they were. And essentially, there are three major fictitious commodities in capitalism: labor, that is the human being, the human body even, the nature, and money. And we need to, I think, a major stake for a sustainable monetary system is to decommodify money. And to decommodify money, we also need to decommodify existence. And that's why I will end on that, just to put a little bit more debate in the discussion. I am always a little bit skeptical about basic income in monetary forms, because there is a risk that they will actually spread like even more the market relation, because the monetary relation is also a market relation. And I think we should think of in-kind basic income, that is turning sectors that are fulfilling basic social needs into commons, to socialize them, and to provide everyone with, say, a basic amount of energy, transport, education, health, housing, and food. So we would not need money anymore to have this, and that would be an in-kind basic income. And that way you can decommodify money, because you also decommodify existence, you decommodify life. That's my final point.
Joe?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm in class writing down so many things. Several things. One, I sort of wanted to, I mean, Mary didn't really bring this up, but she sort of did, or at least she made me think about it. I think there's this problem that when we talk about the Treasury needing to borrow from the markets, that's the way the system works and has worked for the last 40, 50 years. That's not the way the system needs to work, right? That's not the way the system has worked for a long time before sort of the neoliberal revolution. And it's definitely not the way the system has been working in the last few weeks, as we've seen, right? So it's sort of, so I fully agree with Mary. The sort of veil has been lifted from what is possible. And that sort of goes to something that, Louison, you said earlier. You said we don't need to reinvent the wheel. In your original talk, you mentioned that. And yeah, the ways that the central bank has monetized Treasury spending, we've seen it with the Green New Deal. We've seen it in Canada in the 40s and 50s. We've seen it all around the world for a very long time. It became impossible, and there were even legal institutions against it in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But we've seen that veil being lifted again. So it's sort of the stuff that Mary has been screaming for her entire career, like, hey, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this. We're finally seeing that yes, we can, and we always could have. And just to also just agree with Mary again, she talked about taxing the wealthy versus borrowing from them. And I think it again goes to what she talks about a lot, is the ideology that we approach, or that we assign to our monetary system, that wealth comes from the private sector, and then the state is just a parasite sucking off the wealth of the productive private sector. And I think that's sort of why we've decided that we borrow from the wealthy instead of tax the wealthy, because if we tax them, that's going to infringe upon their productive capacities, and they'll just be, the state shouldn't be a parasite on that. So I just can't agree more that the part of that is that heavy ideology. One of the, so in order to slightly push back again, Louison, you mentioned, and I don't want to get too far into this because we could go down the growth imperative debate for forever. I mean, but one of the things that's interesting, and I agree with everything you've said on all the social dynamics inherent in the advent of capitalism. And then I was going to also mention this decommodification that Julio brought up, and this decommodification of money. But what's interesting is I sort of see this commodification of money sort of coming online at the same time that money was assigned an interest rate, which gave money a price, which then allowed it to become a commodity. So I think part of our decommodifying money, it at least requires us to approach the interest rate as a price for which money becomes a commodity. That's not necessarily, I don't want to entangle that with interest is a growth imperative, because I've looked closely at your model and Peter Victor and Tim Jackson's models, and they do prove that stock flow consistent accounting system, clearly given certain assumptions about savings rates and things like that, don't create the growth imperative. But I do want to say that I think the commodity piece of money is closely aligned with that interest rate. But then also, I think a big piece of this also is this growth imperative that hasn't been touched on a ton, but I think we're all talking around it, is this idea of culture. We have to get bigger, as you mentioned, Louison. Companies have to get bigger in order to stay safe, so they're not bought up by other companies, and that's all true. I wonder if, like I was talking about earlier, if we had equity, if the state took equity ownership, or we had cooperative ownership models, if that sort of need to grow in order to save yourself would be undermined a little bit. Now, sure, that's going to get into economies of scale and some of this macroeconomic theory, but I think this cultural growth imperative to get bigger as corporations is in there. Also, though, investment. I mean, I need to invest in the markets in order to have money in my retirement. And that's partly because we've taken, or we've sort of privatized pensions. We've privatized later life living. The community that surrounds being able to take care of our older populations has sort of disappeared to a certain extent. So a lot of people my age and through their career need investment vehicles in order to retire. And I think part of that is the culture of just is privatizing everything and not having these strong social nets, not just in our youth and in our middle ages, but in our old ages, having those social safety nets as well. I mean, there's a million things we could all talk about, but those are just some that were just sort of low-hanging fruit.
Julio?
Thank you, and thank you all. About the growth imperative and sort of the discussion on like interest-bearing debt and so on. I think, well, it's important to separate, the different types of ways in which money is created and how is it allocated. So traditionally, money was created for the purposes, in nation states before the rise of neoliberalism, for the purposes of productive investment. So I'm thinking of Japan, I'm thinking of Taiwan, Korea, in the sort of long-term development of industries, right? And then with neoliberal reforms, you get these two other types of ways of issuing debt or credit, which is for consumer purposes or for the purposes of speculation. Now, I wonder to what extent do the models that we have today actually also take into account the parts that are made for speculation, which oftentimes sort of get outside of the radar of the data that is actually available to us through, money being issued in islands in the Caribbean, for example, and so on and so on. And so for me, thinking about it in sort of very democratic terms is how do we get outside of this sort of bureaucratic logic of where do we allocate the credit to, and actually give power to people to say, we want to allocate money here because we need a new bridge, a new infrastructure, a new technology, and so on. And so how do we do industrial policy without the state, right? How do we go about like arranging our own economy around us in some sort of democratic participative process, which is also a creative process? And then the second thing I wanted to touch upon was this discussion on Polanyi. I'm I guess a grandson grandson of Polanyi in some way, I guess. And yeah, and sort of this relation that I think Luis brought up really well between the wage and the market economy. And so I think it's not only the wage and the way that money became commodified through the embedding of making money have a positive interest. It's also the unpaid labor, the sort of reproductive labor that is oftentimes done by women in most of the world, that is also part of this relation, right? And so when we talk about making a money commons or a credit commons or some like a currency for the commons that helps to nurture the commons rather than exploit them, which is actually what happens today, right? Like private money or state money goes in and sort of through the exploitation of commonwealth or like the ancestry of the past, it's used as a way of sort of growing capitalism as such. And so, but the commons themselves, they don't have a way to reproduce themselves in some sort of cohesive way. So making a money commons, I think it's really, really important if we actually want to not only decommodify labor, but also money. How do we decommodify our own work? We can do that through a basic income. Now, on the discussion of in-kind versus money, I would say this is also not a dichotomic question that we're oftentimes faced with. Do we want basic services or basic income? I think this already presupposes a sort of neoliberal regime where we will only have a basic income and then everything else will be privatized. I think this is a very a dangerous discussion because it can fall on these false dichotomies, and I think we should always argue for having both as a way of sort of changing the paradigm on which we live on. Now, having said that, I mean personally, like even though I support wholly the instances of getting a basic income happening from the state, and one of the sort of definitions of a basic income is that it's unconditional. From a sort of anarchist perspective, I would say the state is already a condition, and so it's really hard for states to really sort of say, okay, you're going to have this money unconditionally, because it would totally change the relationship between how the state governs society. And so this is a tension that I think we have to explore more to think about sort of third ways out of this whole like private-public debate.
Thanks, Julio. Are there any further comments, or we can move to questions from the audience? Okay. So let's start with the first question. It's about demonetization. Should we be imagining post-monetized economies? What viable ways exist for abolishing money in a complex non-agrarian society? It would have to be a gift economy. Should we do just the same order, or anyone would like to start? Mary?
Well, I think I don't think we can do away with money, because money isn't a capitalist thing. That's what we're saying. Money, it's been harnessed by the capitalism, but as far as I know, all human societies from prehistory through history have had money. They've had some unit of measurement, but not for market exchange, but for ceremonial things. For offerings to the gods, whatever their belief is, and money we've talked about it very much as a social relation, and therefore it can be used very, very socially, and not market economically at all. So I think, so if the smallest human communities had something acting as money, then how large, complex, multi-million people societies can manage on a barter system or something, which never really existed. That mythology about money was invented to overcome barter, and there's no evidence of barter communities anyway. I think money is a token of a social relationship, and those social relationships can be very different and in different cultures. But I think we do need some token to make comparative judgments. You know, what do I give to, what do I do if I'm being, because you know, it's been used in anthropology. It's been shown that money is used to settle disputes where there's no rule of law, settle disputes. And you do need a comparative judge, because what do I get for having broken somebody's arm? What do I get for having killed somebody? And if I'm using the social money to show my penitence, then obviously it's not going to be the same measure of money for breaking somebody's arm as killing someone. So I think I just see money as a yardstick, and the more neutral money is, the better it can the more yardstick, as it were, money can be. It's more useful, universally useful. If you start thinking the money itself has a value, then you get into a Bitcoin position where you can't, the money becomes completely unstabilized, because doesn't have a value because it's a commodity. It becomes a commodity because it's money. So it's very unstable, and its value shoots all over the place. So I think we need the most minimal, most basic money system. Oh gosh, sorry, somebody else speak up and mute me, because I've got a phone going. So somebody else take over.
I actually can't agree with Mary more. I mean, if we look, I mean, she's saying, she said pretty much what I will just ditto, but if we think of human society as a monetary society, I think we see that disentangling money from our current society would sort of be problematic. We know we've engaged in monetary relationships around the world for 5,000 years, if not more. So we are a monetary society, and money is this social relation. So I just go back to this idea of, let's not reinvent the wheel. You know, rather than getting rid of money, it might be a little easier to harness money for the good that it has. If we think of money's basic nature as a unit of account. So the neoclassical sort of economic framework says that the money has three functions. It's a medium of exchange, kind of first and foremost, and then it stores value and is a unit of account. We can actually look at it a little differently. Instead of what money does, what money is this unit of account, and this yardstick that Mary was talking about, and this measurement. And then that allows us to look at money as embodying this social relationship. And then what we do with that social relationship is up to us. And if we have more of a gift economy, like the questioner sort of posed, a gift economy isn't necessarily removed from a monetary economy. It just depends on what that money looks like. It doesn't need to be capitalist money. But Marcel Mao wrote a really great book called The Gift, where he talks about money as a total social fact, that the monetary systems we share through gifting and exchanging and giving a bigger gift than you were given, so that there's this credit dynamic that keeps marriages and families together. And it's huge. And money is the total society that Mao was talking about. So yeah, I'll just kind of wrap it up there and just sort of say that I think rather than getting rid of money, I think that it would behoove us to create a better monetary system.
Yeah, may I say something? Yeah. On this note, yeah, I mean, I often get faced with this question, especially actually by Marxist people. They come to me and they say, "Oh, why aren't you more radical? Like, why don't we just abolish money?" And I'm like, that's really kind of crazy, because abolishing money is sort of like trying to abolish language. You know, it's a semantic system in a way. Like, it has this symbolic thing. It has many values. So, as Mary was saying, you know, before the rise of capitalism, money was used to rearrange social relations as opposed to rearrange commodities, right? And so, yeah, I think it's important to sort of decolonize money, or to sort of take away the veil of what it is today. This sort of inversion of an object that represents something that can be turned into another object, and so on, and really say, okay, how can we go about producing money differently with other values? How can we create, for example, an anti-patriarchal money, or yeah, an ecological money and so on. Yeah.
Louison, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just very briefly, because I think everything has been mostly said. I think Mary and Julio made a very powerful point that money should be decommodified, and I think everyone says recalled that right now. But I think if we want to demonetize, we need to decommodify not only money, but then the entire society. And that would change the whole functioning of the society, because there were never ever, and Mary recalled that a couple of minutes ago, there were never ever society organized around barter. There are examples of society with barter, but they were not organized around exchange and barter. And just a small parenthesis, I think it's just properly a scandal that this fairy tale of money to ease exchange as compared to barter is still taught in universities. Every student, any student that is being taught that by their teacher in monetary econ class should ask those teachers for historical evidence of such society. And I can guarantee you, your teacher won't be at ease to provide you those evidence, really. That's, I close the parenthesis. Money was created, most probably invented as a mean to settle debts. And that shows the social relation aspect of money, because debt is first and foremost a social dimension. So to come back to the question, what about demonetization? I think the priority is not necessarily to demonetize, as the speakers have said, but to decommodify. That is to invent other ways of providing essential goods and services. And that could be done through extending social security to other sectors, like in an in-kind basic income scheme, for instance.
Thank you. The next question, can morality be embedded into the design of money? Who would like to answer that?
Yes. Actually, I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, right? Because in a way, for example, I live here in Germany, in Deutschland, and the word for guilt is the same as the word for debt, Schuld or Schulden. And this is similar in many other contexts. And so sort of the morality of money is one of shame, of guilt, that goes from like today's central banks and the way sort of, you know, capitalist modernity works to the rise of Protestantism and also Christianity. You can trace that back all the way to the rise of patriarchy as a system of domination in civilization. So yes, morality is embedded within money, but that does not mean that we cannot make other types of money with different values and different ethics and different moralities embedded to them. For example, yeah, an ethics of care, as you know, as an example.
Louison?
Yeah, just to jump in, that could also bring to another question, that is, since we have argued a bit around this question of interest rate, that is, what could be the role of interest rates in a sustainable monetary system? And actually, in a sustainable monetary system where the central bank would be like fully public and the monetary system would be controlled more or less directly by the citizens, interest rate could be the symbol of the social relation which unite the borrower to the rest of the society, because through granting credit to that borrower, society would acknowledge the more or less useful nature of the activities that will be financed by this. And so in that regard, interest rate, for instance, could be the signal on the level of usefulness of those activities. So for instance, in the immediate future, something we should do, even in the current monetary system, and it's already done to some extent by some central bank, for instance, in Bangladesh, is to differentiate interest rates according to the level of sustainability of the activities, for instance. That could be a way to approach the moral question or the sustainable question, even in the current existing monetary system.
Joe?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, taking it a step further, we can sort of, and I think he was sort of getting at that, is interest rates could be used similar to taxes, right? So we can destroy money and pull money from the system based on interest rates. But then similarly, we could add discriminatorily high interest rates to activities that we didn't want in a society, right? So that gets at that morality piece. And that sort of goes to, we've talked about barter, and I don't want to beat that to death, but the idea of barter as forming the foundation of money is sort of also coupled with this idea of value lays the foundation of money. The economic exchange is what the value in exchange lays the foundation of money. But when we look at money as a social relation, we can look at money as laying the foundation of value. And when I say money, I mean the monetary system, the manner in which money is put into society and removed from society. So if that system is what lays the foundation for value, we can very much place morality within the monetary system. Like Louison was talking about, using credit and issuing credit into industries where we need it, green energy technology, and removing through an interest rate mechanism money from industries where we do not want it, or effects that we don't want, such as income inequality and things like that. So we're able to use the monetary system, because money is the foundation of value, as a way to express our moral, sort of hopes and dreams.
Mary? You're muted.
Yeah, unmute. Oh, I'm unmuted now, aren't I? Yes, thank you. Yes, just to follow on, much as what's been said, I think we have to open the money system to political debate and social debate. And the first thing we have to decide is, where are we going to put our money? Into the market system, into the public economy, or into the social economy? We can make those decisions. Then within those economies, we can make judgments about how the money should be spent in the market, what should be prioritized and not. Like we're talking about green policies, or honoring domestic labor or whatever, or honoring the cost to nature. Or we could have participation in the public sector budgeting, and make a decision about priorities and how much money we need, how much money we need to circulate in our economy, because there's no given about what the exact amount of money circulating is. It's how much you need to achieve what you want to achieve. Money is the servant, not the master. And I think we've got to just get control of it, and get social and political control of money, and not leave it, as Louis was saying, to technical decisions. To me, it's more moral to the core.
Thank you. The next question: is monetary plurality a key element in the design of a diverse and resilient system?
Mayor? Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think so. Totally. I think separating the functions of money, as Joe was saying, from its forms, so like the actual object you're using, is very important. So as I said before, you can have a money that is for exchanging things locally, territorially. I think that's very important as well to re-emphasize that it's not just that we're going to have positive interest rates for something, but also where we're going to actually make that technology happen, right? Because if we're still exploiting things like, I don't know, lithium in Bolivia to make green cars in Germany, I don't know, it's not really quite there. Then the second function as a store of value, also you can have a different money for that, and also as a unit of account. That's how it worked. In places like Egypt, you had places where there was a vault to store grain, and you would give, let's say, 10 kilos of rice, and they would give you a voucher that said 10 kilos of rice, and then you would use that to buy flour, buy services, pay people, and so on. And then at the end of the year, you would come back and they will give you 9 kilos of rice, and you say, hey, wait, what happened? Why are you not giving me 10? I gave you 10. And the guard at the place would tell you, listen, I had to pay the guard. There are a couple of rats. I also had to eat a bit. So here, there are 9 grains for you. And so basically, this is another way of exemplifying what I call the degrowth money or demirage, which is basically a money that rots, just like anything else in life. And so, yeah, I think that's really important into sort of changing the design of money, getting out of this monoculture that wants to have housing, energy, education, and the marketplace all with one type of money. That actually exemplifies the sort of value system underpinning it, which is this sort of top-down patriarchal system, one money to rule them all. A diverse plurality of monies has embedded within it a more complementarity sort of value system, thinking more in terms of interdependency and so on.
Mary? You're muted. You're still muted.
Oh.
Yeah, good.
Well, I'm unmuted now. Right. Thanks. Yes, I'm a bit agnostic on whether you need multiple currencies for different levels. I'm feeling it might just get very complicated. But then if you have trans community currencies like the euro, then you've got the problem of not having a social and political unity about it. But I've worried quite a lot about what you do at a global exchange level in the here and now. And there's two ways you could deal with that, because you've got the problem of interacting with somebody else's currency. And one of the ways, and the inequality, because we assume if we've got local monies that all the local communities are all equal and they've all got an equal range of goods, but they might need to exchange with others. And if you've got a free-for-all like we have now, floating currencies, then obviously currencies, who's in charge of the main currency, i.e. the dollar, gets all the seigniorage benefits from that. And everybody else has to somehow link with the dollar. And it was the pound before that. One of the suggestions put forward by somebody, I forget exactly who it was, said that the international rule should be that everybody should be able to pay in their own currency. So they shouldn't have to get dollars to buy something in dollars. If you come from America, you have to accept the local currency, and this gives the local currency parity, or at least could argue parity. And the other way to do it is to have a buffer currency, which is the kind of Keynesian idea. That and my spin on it is, you should have a buffer currency which no single country operates, and that the job of the buffer currency is to equalize the spending power of every economy, so that if you want to buy, say, a fridge, you pay so many days work from America and the same number of days work from Nigeria, say. And the Nigerians can buy it with a week's work, and the American can buy it with a week's work. So they have parity of purchasing. Because I think, when you talk about degrowth and greening, you get the assumption that it's all going to be done locally and there won't be much national or international. Regional be as good as it gets. I'm not sure that would be the case. I think we'll still have national and international trade of some sorts, and therefore we need a policy of what you do about multiple currencies in the here and now.
If there are no further comments, Louison,
well, yeah, if I can jump in quickly on what Mary just said, because I fully agree with this need to actually reform to have a proper international money that is not a national money that is used as an international money like the dollar, but a proper international money. And I think on that, no need to reinvent the wheel again. I think the proposal that was made originally by Keynes for Bretton Woods is very interesting, and we could revisit it to update it for the current needs. And that reminded me of this nice quote by Keynes to echo what Mary said about the permanency of international exchange within a degrowth world. Keynes had this nice quote saying, "I'm not a fan of free trade. I think production should be primarily, he said, national, we could even say local, when this is possible and reasonable, but culture, humanity, intellectual exchange are international in nature and should be free to circulate. And I like this quote very much, and I think that would work with this kind of true international money that he proposed. And that would be a reversed globalization, a human, environmentally sustainable globalization, as contrary to the finance-led, unsustainable globalization we have now. And the last thing I wanted to say very quick is that we've been talking about value a bit. I think we should be clear on what kind of value we're talking about. Money is the foundation of exchange value, but there are also use values, as you know, and use values are those kind of values that will never ever be able to be expressed in monetary terms. There are a whole range of values that that are incommensurable, that we are unable to express them in monetary terms. And this, I think, is very important, because those values need, those things that embody use value, need to be protected from being commodified, because they cannot be translated into monetary terms.
We still have a couple of questions. Is it okay if we stay a little bit over time, another 15 minutes or so? Yeah, no problem. Okay. Next question. Should all banks be either nationalized or become cooperatives? Can Julio's local creativity challenge the status quo, or should we target the central banks and commercial banks, or both?
I mean, I think we have to sort of organize at all levels of society. So it's not enough to just say, okay, we're going to democratize money at a specific local region. You know, if you actually want to sort of build power from below, this has to happen in many places at the same time, and especially in Europe, especially in the US, right? Because these are sort of the more hegemonic countries in terms of where the hierarchy of value of currencies sort of, you know, circular, like, you know, where everything is concentrated. So I think it's important to have that discussion. Like, for example, right now, in the US, there's this discussion for a centralized, what's it called, digital currency from the central bank. And in a way, this is actually quite, it makes the system even more fragile, and it's sort of reminiscent of the Soviet Union, in my opinion. It's sort of this central planning approach where a central bank takes over and gives everybody this sort of digital currency. And, you know, and it goes into more sort of surveillance. It could go into sort of a more surveillance type of capitalism. So that's a bit of also a danger. Like, it's not just when we talk about money nowadays, it's also, we're talking about, you know, data, we're talking about control and so on. I think fundamentally speaking, if you really want to like change the system from the core, we have to really transform money as in its relationship of ownership. So abolishing sort of central banks might be a way forward. Like, we don't really need central banks. We could totally have a more decentralized run economy. And this is actually, it was at stake in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when Roosevelt was in power. At the time in the US, there were many local currency initiatives. A lot of them were, you know, a product of their time. People didn't have access to cash, and they made their own local vouchers, local money systems. There were, I think, termed emergency currencies, if I'm not mistaken, by the Roosevelt administration. And in the end, they decided to go for the New Deal. And so it's interesting because now we're in a similar position now with this sort of Green New Deal. And I'm thinking, is this sort of green capitalism the way forward, or can we build something else from below?
Are there any further comments? Mary, you're muted.
I'm muted, yeah, right. Yes, in the history of the emergence of banks, the big important moment was when the personal private money issued by private lenders became designated as a public currency. Now, if a private private bank wants to set up and put out its own tokens, like Bitcoin got set up, but with its own tokens, then that is a private matter, and people know that it's a commercial risk. But when the banking system is issuing the public currency, which banks are, I think that it's often said that 97% of the money's in bank accounts, therefore it's all been issued by a bank, and only 3% is notes and coin. But I don't think that the public issue is limited to notes and coin. I think that the public, as we said, the public sector creates money as it spends, and the banks create the public currency as they lend. And for that reason alone, they should be democratized. They should be made nationalized or socialized, because we all take responsibility for the national currency. And there's no reason why the national currency should be privately issued. As I say, if they want to set up a private money and wing it and take the risk, and the people who use it take the risk, then that's another matter. But if they're issuing the public money, the public currency, I don't think it's as much as 97%, but because I think some of the money flowing into the banks comes through the public sector, and that's ignored. But so therefore, there's no justification for the private issue of the public currency.
Louison?
Yeah, just two quick things. I'm a little bit skeptical on what Julio said about the fact that we don't really need a central bank, because if there is something to learn from monetary history, is that no monetary system has survived in the long run without something that looks like a central bank in one way or another. But of course, as we have been discussing since the beginning, we need to discuss who should control the central bank and for what purpose. Now, I just wanted to react to the cooperative proposal. I'm all in favor of cooperative, both in the monetary system and in the productive sphere for cooperative firms and so on. But I don't think that's a miracle solution. I think it's part of the solution, but nowadays we already have a lot of banks who are cooperative banks. And the problem is it remains, if you still have cooperatives within the current competition relations, then you're not really solving the issue. So I think that in that case, money remains a commodity. So cooperative are part of the solution, but to really solve the key issue, we need to decommodify money, and for this we need to fully socialize money, as Mary just explained essentially.
Joe?
Yeah, just to quickly add a thought, no disagreement or anything. When we think about the privilege of money, oftentimes there are three privileges that are brought up. They're the privilege to set the unit of account in a sovereign area. There's the privilege to create credits in that unit of account, and then there's the privilege of profiting from creating that credit, which is referred to as seigniorage. And the state already upholds the first of that privilege, the currency privilege of denominating the dollar, for example, but it is sort of acquiesced those later to the public or to the private banking system. And that's sort of what Mary was getting at, is that these public institutions are creating this public money, private institutions are creating public money, and then the public is then responsible for maintaining the stability of the unit of account when those credits cause the system to go crazy. So it's this sort of risk responsibility that is completely out of whack. And then also the reason I brought that up was to address sort of what Julio and Louison have mentioned, was this role of the central bank. Now the role of the central bank is essentially, it's really complicated, but the goal really is to maintain stability in the commercial banking markets. Right? The goal is to maintain price stability, and they do that through a lot of complex measures, but essentially they want to maintain stability of these commercial banks. I think the central bank then could, in a different monetary future, still exist, but the goal wouldn't be to maintain the commercial banking industry, because those two prerogatives would have then been taken back over by the public. So the public's then creating credits. The public is profiting from creating those credits, and then the central bank maintains money supply according to inflation rules or employment mandates or what have you. So I think we can pull that all back under the auspices of a central bank that isn't simply there to uphold a broken system.
May I throw in some spice for the sake of discussion?
Yeah.
So, okay, if we're talking about a central bank, we have to talk about sort of the class dynamics or the classes that came together to make them happen or to maintain them. So on the one hand, you have the financier class, sort of the banking sector and so on. And on the other hand, you have the warrior class or the armies. So like this relationship, especially in places like the US, is actually what upholds the stability of the economy of the central banks and so on, in some sort of fundamental way. So in a way, it is the violence of the US Army, for example, that actually maintains in some way the dollar hegemony of the world. And so it's an interesting question, right? Because when we talk about democratizing money, the fundamental question that we're asking here is also, what are these institutions actually for, and what are they actually upholding? What is stability, or whose stability is it maintaining, right? I'll leave it there for.
Okay, and the last question, and then we wrap up. Given the reality that degrowth will necessarily look very different in the global south and the global north, what implications, if any, does this have for monetary policies and public banking? Louison?
Well, I think the first condition would be for every country, and that is linked to what has been said before, to every countries or even regions or cities and so on to have the control of their own currency, to have the control of their money. There's no way, for instance, a degrowth society could be implemented in the periphery of the capitalism. I personally prefer this term than global south, rather without a full control of the money. I don't know if you guys followed it, but recently there was a strong push for France to finally stop controlling the money of a lot of former French colonies, which was the case up until now. The Bank de France is actually managing the money for a lot of African countries, which is completely insane, right? So that is the first condition. If you want to create your own local productive system, sustainable productive system, sustainable economy, you need to have the control of your own money.
Joe? Oh, Joe and then Mary.
Nothing major. I just think adding on to that is also debt jubilees for global south countries that are indebted and will unable to largely ever be able to get out of those debt payments without growing massively, which then, in order to grow, causes increase in debt. Like, we need debt jubilees for those countries. There's no question. Yeah, that's my addition for that point. Yeah.
Mary?
Well, the problem is coming, which is concerned me a lot, is that my advocacy of public money is the public money is not necessarily subject to democratic use, and that if you've got countries that don't have a very developed banking system, then they would be running on public money, which, if you don't have democracy, could be harnessed by whoever is in control of the money system. When we were told, like things in Afghanistan, that all the local warlords all issue their own money. And in Libya, the two civil wars that's going on in Libya, they each have their own money system. So public control of the money, which we're advocating here, has to be democratic monetary control, because many societies have just feather-bedded the rulers who have control of the money system. So so although I'm in dead support of debt jubilee and all the rest of it, in the way the IMF was going around imposing neoliberal philosophies on local economies, I think we owe it to people around the world to take the idea of a democratic public money system to support people to get control of the money system themselves as a population, and not to both the banking money and the public money can be used for good or ill, and so that's just a note of caution.
Yes, I totally agree. We need people-powered money. We don't need, it's not bank money per se or state money, but people-powered money, where you can see the relationships that give it value. The value of money comes from its social life, not from some sort of imposed idea of gold being intrinsically valuable or anything like that. If people have control over money, then they can have control over a lot of other aspects of their lives. And that's not to say that we shouldn't forget about these other aspects. It's just sort of a holistic view that we must have to democratize life around us and make other worlds that are possible happen.
So I guess we can wrap up. If you have any concluding remarks that you would like to make, please share your thoughts. And also we received some criticism that this talk we haven't covered enough international currency and the dominance of the dollar and alternatives to the petrodollar. So if you'd like to add more on the international currencies, please comment together, share together with your concluding remarks.
I'm not going to say anything more on this because we tackled it a little bit in the discussion. The only thing I want to do now is to go on YouTube and watch Notorious Big song "More Money, More Problems."
Mary?
All I'd like to say is what I'd like to say is I see the history of money, particularly the recent history of money, following the three stages that Marx identified. That is, you have authoritarian control of money, then the commercial banking system liberates that from the authoritarian state, but we now have to socialize it out of the market. The market has opened up the system, and we now have to socialize money and bring it within that kind of framework. So perhaps we had to go through the commercial banking stages, but now we must move on. So anyway, that's my sort of feeling.
Joe?
I'll respond just briefly to the question there, or the very slight critique was I completely agree. And I think when we talk about a degrowing economy, a lot of times we obviously also talk about energy transitions away from hydrocarbon energy forms. The global fossil fuel industry is denominated in dollars. So as we make a transition to non-fossil fuel based energies, we're going to see changes in the dollar hegemony. If we don't address energy transitions at the same time we're addressing dollar hegemony and international finances more broadly, we're going to see destabilization there. So I think all of these things, and maybe this is the final comment on every one of these talks, is these are really complicated and tangled issues. So we can't just do one in isolation of the others. Money and energy all work together along with democracy and along with so many other things. So.
Yeah, totally agree. I think we touched on it a bit, but I think it's important to re-emphasize it and also to fill out these gaps in thought that we still have, which is like, for example, in Germany, the government is sort of pushing this sort of green agenda with green cars and so on, to sort of say, yes, we are, bio-Deutsch, we're not gonna get into this oil business, but at the same time, we're gonna go and exploit maybe like the places where capitalism is sort of extracting resources sort of only shift. So instead of oil, it goes to lithium, right? And so the question at hand is actually, how do we create or design liberatory technologies based on the resources around regions, that are extracted fairly, and actually, actually create those transitions in a viable way, and also whilst also changing the money system. And so this is the sort of the hack that we have to sort of figure out. And in terms of the dollar hegemony, it's going to be an interesting question to see for how long that will remain. Yes, and I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you so much. That was a super interesting discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank the audience for watching us. And I'd like to remind you that next week we have another webinar, which will be on the Green New Deal and political economy of degrowth. And also we're preparing a few more sessions for June, so please keep an eye on our updates. Thanks a lot. Oh, Louison?
Sorry, just a very final word. Next weekend, not this weekend, but the one after, online, there is the conference Strategies for Degrowth with a lot of interesting sessions, including a money and finance session, and you can still register for it if you want to attend, and it's free. And thank you very much, guys, for organizing this talk. It was great.
Thanks for joining. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.